Welcome everyone. We're gonna start today's lecture by Mikel Forcada in the lecture series of our Masters in Research in Translation and Interpretation. Mikel Forcada retired as a full professor of computer languages and systems at the Universitat recently, last year in 2024. He was responsible for both Apertium and Bitexto, the free and open source projects. And he has been actively involved in developing software to advance minority languages in the digital world, for which we are very grateful. He's also the founding partner and chief research officer of Prompsit language engineer. And today he will be presenting a taxonomy of the harmful effects of machine translation and some strategies for the mitigation. This research was part of the book, The Social Impact of Automating Translation, published in 2024 by Routledge. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And the floor is yours. I'm going to present your slides.
There you go. Thank you very much, Esther.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so I will be... Thanks a million. My company will kill me if I only talking about bad things this time, but I asked for permission, so should be okay. So I'm going to be talking about the harmful effects of machine translation, their mitigation, and also a little bit about legal protection and legal risk associated to harm. So, you know, machine translation is good. There can be no denying that it's good for assimilation. That means reading other people's work in a language we don't understand. But it's also used in dissemination. It might lighten, it might ease the work of professional translators. But all of this good does not come without any bad, and the talk is about this harm. One thing I'd like you to keep in mind is that I will talk about the harms of machine translation, which is now a small technology compared to what they call generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, which is based on large language models, but which are derived from the latest models in machine translation, actually, which are transformers. And all of these have similar harms or have similar effects. And it's a good idea to keep that in mind while I'll talk, because I think my contribution here is getting old and someone has to complete it. I'm not going to do it because I retired. So, and one thing is I'm not a lawyer. I might therefore be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected. So for this taxonomy, I thought of using the same system that journalists use about a piece of news, who did which harm to whom and how. They say things like where and when, things like this. But to ask a question that has many question marks, many interrogative parts. And I will use this to classify a bit 9 kinds of harm. And I know that the list might not be complete. So work for someone to complete the list. Harm number one is basically about copyright. So machine translation system developers may be seen as causing loss of revenue to translators as authors, because they use their translations to create new products that add new value. New value is created by these machine translation system developers. And clearly, these products may be considered derivative work that might be in violation of copyright. And there's some earnings to be had, some money to be made downstream, and it's not shared with translators that in the first place authored those translations that are being used to train the systems. So this is for translation memories, and a similar harm occurs with the machine translation system, which may also be considered derivative. So this is one harm to translators as authors. Harm number 2 and 3 are very similar. Is again the tortfeasor, the harm maker is machine translation system developers, and they cause loss of revenue and de-skilling in translators. So translators are de-skilled because they are forced to work with translation memories. And first, this causes price cuts because it gives translation providers a chance to negotiate price cuts or force price cuts, and which are called fuzzy match discounts. And also, translators work in a very different way. They don't know where the translations come from. They have been pre-translated, so they don't know what translation memory they came from, probably. Many times they have to guess the context to get a good translation, and they end up being tiny cogs in a big machine, which is an image that George Morkens used in his paper. To add insult to injury, it's not only translation memories where translators would still have the chance to translate something in the way they like when there's no proposal from the from the translation memory. They can be machine translated and then be turned into post editors of segments without a context. With the machine translation, they don't know, and they are smaller and smaller cogs in a bigger and bigger machine. So there's industrialization of machine translation, or this, Jos Morkens calls it Taylorization, because of Taylor, the theoretician of industrialization, is changing completely the profession, and it's not changing it probably for the good of translators. Harm number 4 is environmental. When you train these systems that you use to do machine translation from corpora, you need to build massive resources, machines, places to house them, and this generates toxic and inert waste. And they also they use a lot of energy, so they generate a lot of greenhouse effect gases. So they generate CO2, and they make our world more difficult. And training also generates heat, because computers do nothing. If you think of it, I mean, computers use energy and don't move anything around, don't lift weights, don't do anything. So all of the energy turns into heat. And that heat needs air conditioning to be taken out, because instead machines would fry. So you need all these environmental effects, which in principle occur for everyone, usually are more heavy on vulnerable communities. For example, I have these examples where I change the countries with the same letter, like Bangladesh will get a much better share of this harm than Belgium, probably. Or Haiti would get more than Hungary, or Somalia would get more than Slovenia. So this is one problem that we have, and I'm citing here my host Esther, because she has a bit about this in one of the chapters of the book we are presenting. Harm number 5 is about disempowerment of small language communities via what people call vendor lock-in, in the sense that you have a language community, typically a small language community, and it's forced to use a single or just a few machine translation providers to do things with the language, process text, translate into and out of this language. And that community loses control of the output of the machine translation system, and it may also be harmed by unilateral changes in the terms and conditions and pricing of the service that these few companies are offering. And this think AI, I mean, there's a big concentration of computational or language computation power now being brought about by these technologies. Harm number 6 is a version of harm number 4, but not about training, but instead when running the systems. So when you train, you use much more energy than when you run a machine translation system, but you run it much more often than you do. So the harm is less intensive, but is very extensive. So we have the same problems. We have greenhouse effects and harmful effects, which are unequally distributed among communities. Harm number 7 is misinformation. So when a multilingual website provider uses machine translation and it doesn't use it correctly, which is the usual case, they may end up misinforming the general public because they are generating faulty or inaccurate textual information. So people are reading things which are not adequate. And this, in the case of, let's say, a hotel review or a Google review or a TripAdvisor, whatever, maybe it's not a big deal. You just go to the wrong hotel. It happens to be you lost some money. No one dies. But if it's health information, we might be in trouble. Or if it's legal information, you can be in deep, deep trouble if you got the wrong information because someone used machine translation and didn't bother to use it correctly. On the other hand, the public wouldn't be the only harmed party because this may backfire, and then whoever asked for this to be machine translated in a website may get a reputational loss because they say, oh no, you cannot trust these guys, they have the wrong information. So this idea of knowing how to use machine translation has been given many times by Lynn Bowker. She has a chapter in the book too, and she's been talking extensively in the last 5-6 years about MT literacy, even more. So read her. Harm 8. This is, okay, so machine translation is known to amplify, to exacerbate unjust biases which were present in the texts that were used to train them. So texts contain unjust biases against certain underrepresented people or communities, and these biases may not be completely taken care of by machine translation, by post-editing. So post-editors may not be aware of that, and then these unjust biases may still be present even in translations which have been post-edited, because the systems do exacerbate the gender bias, like for example Garcia Gonzalez discusses in the paper, in the chapter. But many other gender bias is a very common subject now in machine translation research because it's clear. It's a clear phenomenon, and if people don't post-edit with care, they may not completely remove those biases, or they may not compensate for those biases, and that is an injustice to the readership. And a harm which is related to this, probably more general, is that whoever is using machine translation to translate and post-edit may mediate the colonization of the language community by the source language community, by incompletely post-editing or incompletely calquing the frameworks of the source culture. And there are things which are very simple, like language impoverishment, like always getting the same translation for the same word when the community clearly uses different words. And machine translation systems are notoriously good at simplifying language. And also the Gen AI models are also notoriously known for standardizing very much and simplifying. Also, the problem is that the target text may not be useful in the culture, or may be harmful in the culture because it promotes mental frameworks which don't agree with what that community wants to be. So these are the 9 harms, and I'm going to talk a bit about mitigation, a little bit about legal protection, and then a little bit about legal risk, and you'll see why. So harm 1, translators as authors are not properly paid, their copyright is violated. But what I contend here is that most translators are workers, okay? I know that people think they're freelance entrepreneurs, and many people live under this illusion, but they sometimes have just one customer or two. So is that really, no, I don't know. So if you see yourself as a worker, and I think that's a nice setting to understand, particularly when you're going to end up being a tiny cog in a big machine, you probably should think about unionizing, organizing as a in common interest, because as the poster from it's an American poster, united you can bargain, but divided you can only beg. You can, so that's a problem. So of course there's this ideological barrier that say, oh no, we're entrepreneurs, we're not going to do what workers do. It's probably unconscious, but there's this, I'm an entrepreneur, okay? And then on the other hand, we have legal things like you're really an entrepreneur for, legally you are a company, so you cannot organize, you cannot agree on prices because that would be seen as trust, as generating a trust, and you can end up being targeted by antitrust policies by people who are damaged by this negotiation. There are alternatives. For example, Cruz Mantecon in a book I can't remember now which book it was. In the paper, there's the site, the correct reference. People could manage their collective rights in societies that manage collective rights and they protect them. So that could be one way. But as we will see, this is a very hard to mitigate harm. And I will collect harms 2 and 3, which were about technologies causing loss of revenue because they publish machine translation systems and translation memories that are used to force price cuts on translators. So in addition to unionization, which I think it perfectly fits here because it's clearly about revenue and about earnings, we can have also translators could also technically organize by doing creating community-owned translation data commons and things that can help them do their work better. And this is challenging because of this individualistic nature of the translation profession, but it's probably the only way to move from pre-translation, where your customer sends you a pre-translated text which you have to repair, and move to a more interactive translation flow where you're in charge. No? This has been studied by, there's papers about this de-skilling of professional translators as old as 2006 and 5 that I know of, like Ignacio Garcia, for example, had this paper about de-skilling in the Journal of Machine Translation. What do you call it? Harms, which are harms, environmental harms. I will collect them because both training and running the machine translation systems generate a lot of about environmental problems. So there are ways to mitigate this, and one way is to make pre-trained models publicly available for retraining or tuning. So instead of retraining your model again with your data, you basically take a model that has been trained and you just tune it. You fine-tune it to your task, and this uses less resources and then produces less environmental problems. There's, for example, Opus has the Corpus MT system, the Opus MT system, which you can run on a regular PC, and it's interesting. We're using it with our students. We were using it with our students in last year, and it's being used now. And you can run your own machine translation system in your machine, which does not cause so much environmental problems. Obviously, it's not the same as the big one, but it does work. This is done by, and you can also retrain it. You can use it inside your CAT system and ask it to try to do better what it's doing, and then you can leave it overnight to kind of fine tune a bit. The other possibility is to use, in connection with that, you can use optimized or quantized models, which are models that are smaller than the big models that you train and can be run on reduced hardware. And this is, for example, you don't need GPUs, you don't need the big AI hardware. You use just CPUs like your regular computer. And one thing that we should never forget is that we could favor the use of linear technologies, like, for example, rule-based systems. Rule-based systems are thousands of times more energy efficient per word. Of course, they might lead, for example, to more post-editing because they don't get the themes as right as the new systems do. But one could consider what's the cost of translation versus the other costs or the other harms that would be produced by a system that uses much more energy to produce things. You have to bear in mind one thing. I skipped that in the slide. I just remembered now that a machine translation system running on a machine, on a computer, does not do, I mean, a computer doesn't do anything. It just uses energy but doesn't move, or I didn't say that, doesn't lift weights, or it just generates heat. So we need air conditioning for that. So more power. So it's good to have leaner systems. And for example, if you want to translate from Spanish to Catalan, which are very similar languages, are very related, you may be okay with things like Apertium, which has a much smaller carbon footprint than the system. So that's one way of mitigating, using the right technology. Using your bike to go to work means making more effort than using your car, but maybe it's better for everyone if you go and use your bike a little bit. So this is the idea. RBMT, rule-based machine translation, as the bicycles in machine translation. Okay, so mitigation of harm 5. Remember, this is the vendor lock-in of small language communities. The only way is for those language communities to first self-organize and generate their own systems, which is something that, for example, the Catalan language community has done through Softcatalà, for example, and through governments, but also through NGOs like Softcatalà, where they have created systems that you can download. You can download the corpus, you can retrain it yourself. All the software, everything is available, so it's publicly is developed in Vue. And the other possibility, another example of communities organizing themselves is Masakane, which is a community of African language technologies, and they're doing these things too. Another possibility is to rely on states, which are an imperfect representation of people, but they could run and generate machine translation systems. And one example, just one, is e-translation, which is the system that the European Commission uses, which can be used by institutions and some companies, and it's being more and more open. Harm 7 is about the harm that you produce when you publish insufficiently or incompletely post-edited material to the web. And of course, the first mitigation is, oh, come on, you should post-edit it properly, or use exact matches from translation memory. If you cannot machine translate, at least use an exact 100% match from your translation memory. One possibility is to clearly flag and machine translated content. So you say, careful, this is machine translation, so you know what to expect. And this relates to how the people should be aware of the fact that machine translation has to be used carefully. And it's this literacy about how people use machine translation is very important. Also, maybe it's a good idea to teach them that a translator is a person, but that's a different thing. I assume that you get a 20-year-old now on the street and you say, send me, do you know what a translator is? They would just get their hands in the pocket and show you the mobile phone because they don't know what a translator. So that's another story, invisibilization of the translation profession. Okay, so, and one thing that Anthony Pym liked to say is that the best policy is probably to have one, and at least there should be a policy on how to use machine translation in public-facing servers. And as far as I know, there is very little about that. Harm 8 is about about how machine translation, when it is incompletely post-edited, it discriminates against underrepresented people or communities. And here, the only way is to train the post editors to take care of this. So this is something that can be done in universities. Is, okay, people think machine translation is solving everything, is generating such a good, and you can use it as it is. No, because they still preserve or even amplify the biases that were encoded in the corpora. And these biases have to be detected, which is sometimes hard, and corrected. Another possibility would be to actually modify the machine translation systems so that they don't do this. But that's harder. You can modify training corpora, that's very hard and very dangerous because you can make mistakes by modifying, because the only way you can modify 100 million words is by doing it automatically. So you might be in trouble, you might be introducing other problems. Another possibility is to do domain adaptation after training, and that may work. So you have a system which has been trained on dirty text, and you use some clean text to remove some of the injustice. There are people like Birhan in her paper, which is cited in the chapter, that talks about it's not about repairing or patching; it's about thinking about the whole process. But that's difficult. And harm 9 is a version of this. It's more like cultural colonization. So how do you mitigate this idea that when you translate a text from a source culture, you are calquing sometimes the frameworks of that source culture, and the only way is to even train better translators, and this is the place, the university, to analyze the work critically and think: Am I doing this? Am I being faithful, as translators say, to the culture for which I am generating my text? Am I talking really to the values of the community that will read those? So that's it's a difficult problem. Okay. So mitigation, you see, mitigation is hard, and legal protection is going to be even harder, as you're going to see. So what's legal? Legal protection is when you have regulations or legislation that protect you from certain harms. So the idea is that if X, an agent, contravenes or laws or regulations that protect the interests of Y, then they get penalties or obligations, or they have to compensate Y. X has to pay in some way because they did wrong. Legal protection, even if perfect, has problems because there's also the concept of legal risk that I will discuss in a minute. There is legal protection for some of the harms I listed that I know of. Maybe I'm not aware of some. As I said, I'm happy to be corrected. But for example, harm 1 has perfectly well encoded legal protection is all the copyright law. Copyright law is extensive, detailed, and even sometimes automatic. Like if you publish something on a website and you don't put any license on it, you're automatically claiming that you reserve all rights because your country is a signatory of the Berne Convention, which is signed by 200 countries or something like that, many countries. And then, okay, the question maybe is a sentence-aligned corpus that of the kind you use to train MT or to generate translation memories, is this derivative work? I take a stand here. I think that corpora are derivative work because they derive from the translation. And there is some protection also in the EU against what they call text mining. Text mining means just roaming the webs and crawling and scraping text and using it. According to this directive, which is, I think it's unenforceable, it says that you have to get permission from every single owner to be able to collect a corpus of text, which is unfeasible, I think. But what happens is that the big companies just avoid being in Europe and go to other countries where things are easier. In fact, even in those countries where things are easier, they still find some problems, and they strongly lobby governments and legislators to waive copyright protection for their systems to be trained. Harms 2 and 3 I will collect because it's about translators losing income because of automation, which is old story. There's nothing new about this. There is antitrust legislation which works the other way around, so it's actually protecting not the translator, but other people, because you cannot collectively bargain prices. But the EU has guidelines published 3 years ago as possible exceptions that could be claimed, could be invoked to antitrust legislation in the case of what they call solo self-employed people providing services predominantly to one undertaking, meaning, okay, you have only one customer, you're not a company, you're just a worker. And in this case, we give guidelines that say that you should not be prosecuted for doing this, basically. 4 and 6, remember, this is about greenhouse, toxic waste, all this. I have found very little specific protection about this in that refers to MT training or AI training and development. And we know that countries have general environmental agreements. So, for example, there's the Bamako Agreement, Bamako Convention, I think it is, where countries decided not to buy toxic waste from. It's basically about underdeveloped countries not buying toxic waste from the big countries because this was a source of corrupt governments just getting money from poisoning their peoples, basically, with toxic waste. And it's usually toxic waste typically ends up in poor countries. So again, most of the effects are much worse on the more vulnerable people. We have the the so-called AI Act. That's actually pseudonym for a much longer name, which was adopted by EU in last year. And I skimmed through it, well, actually read it, and there's very little about protecting your environment from this. There's very little, talks about scenarios of serious damage, talks about establishing regulatory sandboxes. I don't really know what they are, but talks about mitigating the risks. And then there's the mention of the impact of AI systems on environmental sustainability, energy efficient programming and things. But there's very little which is normative. So it's very little normative in there. So very little legal protection. Harm 5 is this disempowering. The only way would be for that community to have access to or to generate legislation that can be enforced, and it has antitrust clauses. So there's no way that, for example, the government can buy machine translation from a single provider. I'm not aware of this being done anywhere. Harm 7 is this about misinforming the public by using incompletely or non-postulated machine translation on a website. There is very little of legal protection on the way of legal protection for this. There is some general rights recognized. For example, the Spanish Constitution recognizes the right to freely receive truthful information. So the writers of the Spanish Constitution were thinking about wrong news or fake news or things like this. But it's very general. There's very little about this. Discrimination, unjust biases, which is another harm the machine translation can inflict. There's a little about, countries have like some guidelines about public facing text. Like for example, in Spain, we have Organic Law 3/2007, which talks about non-sexist language, but it's very vague. And there's very little or nothing about other biases. So there is no explicit legal protection. Of course, you could claim in court that you're being discriminated against, and good luck with that. But if there's no legal protection, it's very hard. And finally, I can't think of any legal protection against colonial frameworks in translation. So let's forget about that. To finish, I'll talk about legal risk. Okay, so legal risk, remember, I'm not a lawyer, but the concept of legal risk is important because, as you say, you have to put yourself in the shoes of who's harming you to understand this, because this talks about their rights, their risk, not your risk. So it's their risk of the tortfeasor, of the harming agent. So legal risk is what's the potential for me losing money or reputation or whatever because someone I've been harming has successfully won a legal dispute against me. So that's the risk. Let's think of it as a probability. It's like how likely it is for these people to actually sue me and have success and get a compensation from me. But it's important to see it from that side, because that's the way most big, as we will say in a minute, most big legal advice is used by tortfeasors in this case, and not by regular people. So X has more money to pay legal. And legal risk may be very low because of being the product of many small factors that get smaller and smaller as you it's a diminishing product. So, for example, you have to have effective legislation protecting you from harm, protecting Y from harm from X. That's hard, and we know that there's very little on that. respect. This Y has also had to be aware of their legal rights. No, this is something that they cannot do to me. Then you need a swift system because justice delayed is justice denied. So you need someone who gives you compensation, but not where you get it, not your children, for example, because you died. So you have to be fast because instead it's no justice. You have to have money to be able to sue big corporations. Some have, but as we will see, but it's hard. You have to be able to provide substantial evidence of harm. So I lost money because of this. How do you prove that? Because that's hard. So you have to convince the judge, you have to convince the court and say, yes, and the court has to understand your claim and think, oh yeah, you've been harmed, you've been effectively harmed, and then you have to be able to win the litigation. So you have to have success. You have to get a ruling in favor of you, and that's very hard. So all of this means that in this risk, which I'm going to discuss one risk now, it is very hard to actually protect yourself from harm. Harm one is the one which had much better legal protection. So I'm going to discuss that. And how do you prove in court that someone is using bags of random isolated translation fragments from your work, which are clearly derivative work, and they're mixed with the work from other people. And this is work you have already been paid for. Okay, so you've been paid for. So what's your loss here? It's hard to prove that this is harming you. And this is challenging. You could invoke harms 2 and 3, and it's going to be used against me to make me pay me less, but it's hard. It's very hard to prove. And in fact, what happens now is that larger artificial intelligence companies are actually lobbying government to make exceptions in copyright law, because even with that such a low legal risk, they are a bit worried. So, and they want to make sure that they can just free ride all the work that other people have produced. There is actually a number of legal suits. The famous one against Meta, which is the owner of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And Kadri, he's the novelist, and he has sued them. And this is now going back, I think, because I think it's so there was a ruling against, and now Kadri is striking back in another court, in another district or something. So they are. This is on Wikipedia, so this is a very famous litigation, because litigation against AI is very, very, very common now. Also, we have associations of literary translators, like for example, the CEATL, who are saying, no, we shouldn't. They have they express their opinion, but expressing your opinion is not going to protect anyone, I think. So I think people should be more practical. So the legal risk is low. If you are OpenAI, if you are Meta, if you are Amazon, if you are Google, you're not in big trouble. It's hard to be in big trouble for big companies. So to conclude, I'm going to say that while machine translation can be beneficial, we have to think about harms, and the way of I think I have tried to convince you that it's a good idea to focus on who does which harm, to whom and how, to understand this. And this is a taxonomy that is incomplete, but I showed you 9 examples to study what's the mechanism of harm, how do you mitigate harm, and what are the possible legal protection and legal risk associated to that harm. And I know, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that this study needs to be revisited in 2025, because now we have generative AI using large language models, which do machine translation and many other things. And actually, this is derived from machine translation systems. So someone has to do this work, and I'm retired, and I'm not planning to do this. So who dares? And you have a short URL and a QR code. If you want the slides are free. You can use them for your talks if you want, if you think they're useful. You just have to cite me and share them with the same license. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There has been some commenting on the chat.
Let's see.
There are a lot of, you cannot see that, but there are a lot of hands clapping
Thank you.
online, and there are also some comments. If we can start with those comments, and you can write down anything you want to ask, and I'll read it out. Or maybe you can just take your open your mics and talk. We also have some people here physically on the audience. So if you want to share anything or comment, just feel free to start.
Just take notes just in case. I don't want to forget about questions.
Otherwise, I can comment on what's being said during your talk. There was the comment about organizations, spurred some comments because, well, we have been translators and interpreters have been traditionally, with exceptions, of course, traditionally bad or are organizing. And now with technology is bringing jobs to virtuality, and that makes us even more delocalized. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to organize, which of course it may be to find out how to reactivate political collective action and political will among translators and interpreters could be a topic for a master thesis if anyone any of our students.
I'm sure someone is studying.
So if they want to take that on, but how can we overcome this delocalization through technology? Are there any tools technology can offer?
One would expect that technology would help you organize.
Yeah.
But in fact, the way technology is being used is basically isolating you. Some companies even make you sign a contract where you say you cannot interact with other people about your job. But even in this case, if you think about the general public, not only that small community, which is professional translators, we all have a lot of social networks in our pocket. And what they do? They probably isolate us because we end up just paying attention to things that we cannot do much about. And we don't pay attention to just our neighbors. And in this case, I think this was, I'm not saying anything new, this was discussed by Jos Morkens in the past about something that, and Louis, I think, 2019, I think they were discussing that, I mean, this is supposed to be able to easily connect all translators so that they can organize, but on the other hand, it's being used to turn them into a small cog in a big machine. And this is something that I don't have a response. But I think the first thing is awareness, that people have to be aware, like regular people on the street have to be aware that this is basically anesthetizing them so that they don't take any action against injustice. For example, whatever the injustice is, each one has its own subjective perception of injustice, but you're not going to do anything because you're trapped on whatever social network or whatever thing, and you think you're in the world and the world is just going this way. And some people are not doing this, they're just taking advantage of that.
Another issue to be developed or research, maybe how to attune organizations, so traditional organizations, professional organizations, with the values of newcomers or people who are working in this isolated context, for them to connect to those traditions, because otherwise lawsuits and lobbying is going to be extremely difficult and, well, actually discouraged, completely discouraged.
So first, as I said, first, each professional translator has to be aware. I mean, each harmed party, I mean, it could be professional translators, could be people from a small community, they have to be aware that they're being harmed, which is tricky sometimes, because they have, the system has lots of ways to convince us of whatever it's they want, which may be the contrary to reality. So one thing, that's the thing. I don't want to sound conspiranoid, but this is, the system does not want you to be aware of your injustices, because then you would act, and the big ones don't want you to act. So the other thing would be to talk to other people about how bad things are and what you can do. And this is something that is probably not happening. Associations are doing a bit of that, but I don't think, so it's a matter of empowerment. I think people have to organize in a way that they can actually make a difference, so they can actually leverage the power they have. And this means using some effort, because the field is not level. It's just against you. So you have to organize and do a lot of effort. And the system is, in general, is against any kind of organization. So that's, I know this is something very political, but I think this is that clearly the only way that big groups of harmed people can get something is by organizing. I think that's that some people might think that's wrong or it's not, but that's the only way they can get better treatment is by organizing and just trying to do something about it.
And the more the better.
But the first thing is to know, and I think translation studies, instructors, professors in universities should make students who are going to be translators in 5 years aware of what is awaiting them. And this is something that I don't think I've heard. I'm done it in my classes. I say, have you ever thought about this? And they go like, or you ask them about how much money they want to make and they say ridiculous because of law. They say, no, I'd just be happy with this. I say, no, that's not a proper living from translation. So people are like kind of accepting it, and I don't think so. That's one of the problems. It's the way it is. So accept it.
Oh, there's one. I'm going to read it out loud because it's quite long. From Martin Ariano. Thanks for your talk, Mikel. You mentioned source cultural colonization as one of the harmful effects. I believe the post-editing phenomenon is a case in point. 1000 ISO post-editing guidelines state that post-editors should retain as much of the raw empty output as possible, even if you're doing full post-editing. But at the same time, we expect them to improve the style of the output. I see post-editing as a balancing act with conflicting guidelines. Terrell, back in 2019, described post-editees as a balancing act with conflicting guidelines. Oh, sorry, that's the line broke. Oh, describe post-editees as exacerbated translationees. How would you train post-editors to identify and correct excessively literal translations, post-editees?
So the person who asked this question has it clear in the sense that it's a balancing act because you have your employer or your whoever wants you to have the translation fast, so he wants you to use as much of the machine translation as possible because it's perceived as you being more productive by doing this. That's a measure of productivity. So use as much as you can of what's already translated, which means don't worry about calcs, they're okay. So this is a problem, but I have no idea how these things operate in I'm not a translation studies person. But I think this is a thing that reflects itself in what people call posterities. Also, I know that there are people that don't like these terms like translationese and posterities, but whatever, is these characteristics that's shining through of things that are in the source language into the target language and probably don't belong there. And this is something that that is, the only way is education, I think, as I said. I find a very hard way to mitigate it unless whoever is translating is aware of what is adequate for that translation, and then balancing that with his making a living out of this, because then you need to meet deadlines and things like this, and you kind of polish your translation as much as you would like. Everything is a balancing act. I always think, I told my students that translation is a kind of engineering. So it's not science, because science is like translation studies, which would be science, but then the profession is about how do I apply this in the real world? And then there's all these restrictions, means balancing and compromises. But yes, completely agree. And I know Toral's work very well. Toral was in our group. He did his PhD things, and he's back in Alicante now. I left, but he's there. So
might be the next one to come here.
Probably.
I think Sharon O'Brien also has a study discussing the ethics of translation, how to balance the ethics of your own ethics as a translator with what you're being demanded from the market. So yeah, that's tough.
But we do that every day in life. There's many things I think, I know this is wrong, but I have no time to do it right. So there's many things we could do better, like taking a bike to work. But you say, no, I'm late. I have to leave the children in school. I have restrictions. I was reading today that honor is not about doing things perfectly. Honor is about just basically navigating this. Honor or virtue is like being able to navigate that in the best possible way. So there goes a thought.
Any other questions? Not here, not in the audience. Okay, then we may
It's very good.
close the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
for
Happy to be contacted, even if retired.
exploited just a little bit. Thank you for attending the lecture.
Yes, thank you very
We'll look forward to seeing you again in other master's researching, translation, and interpreting sessions. Thank you very much.